The subcommittee will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recesses during today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. First, let me just say how pleased we are to have you here, Secretary Bunch. It's a delight for us. We want to congratulate you on this new position. As I said earlier at your reception, we first met when you were at UNLV doing a symposium there, and they send you greetings and congratulations. So thank you for joining us. As we all know, the Smithsonian is really a crown jewel for our government. It's the world's largest research, education, and museum complex in all the world. 21 museums and galleries, which attract more than 28 million visitors just last year alone. In addition, the Smithsonian Affiliates Program connects this Washington-based institutions to nearly every state in the country. It's not just limited here, it's everywhere, as well as Puerto Rico, and I know you have many research programs around the world as well. My district in Las Vegas, for instance, is home to the Smithsonian-affiliated National Atomic Testing Museum, which tells the story of our nuclear weapons testing program at the test site, its contributions to national defense, and also the impacts, both good and bad, that the testing had on the region and the people involved there, and also those who live downwind. So thank you very much for bringing the show and tell articles from the museum to share with us. All of these collections are just critical to telling our nation's story, educating current and future generations. What child doesn't want to go to see this Air and Space Museum? What historian doesn't want to visit the East Wing or other parts of the museum here? So it's you have an incredible treasure. And we, although you deal with appropriators, are really the committee that's responsible for overseeing all the public buildings, including the facilities of the Smithsonian. And so it's important that we carry out that oversight, and American taxpayers know that they are really getting their money's worth if they can't come and see it for themselves. So today's hearing will examine the Smithsonian's current real estate portfolio, as well as expansion, renovation, and acquisition plans, the maintenance backlog, the purchase of new headquarters building, and the Smithsonian Institution's building naming policy. I would point out here how much we appreciate the fact that you have a commitment to sustainability and that the new African American History Museum has met the LEED gold standard, and so we want to encourage that to continue. We're delighted that you're here. Another thing I want you to talk about, if you will, Mr. Secretary, I'm a co-sponsor of the Smithsonian Women's History Museum bill, which passed out of committee last night, and also the National Museum of American Latino Act. So if you could address kind of where those might be going or what we can do to help to promote those and tell us how you're growing those endeavors. I'm relatively new to this chairmanship, but over the last year or so, I've noticed that there's a real disconnect between the Smithsonian and our committee. I believe the last hearing that we held was in 2007. So we don't want that to be the case going forward. I feel a real affinity for this institution and want us to work together to develop more of a relationship and more of a collaboration. We know that the Smithsonian is looking at authorizations, it's looking at appropriations, but we don't want that to just be the authorizing process without coming to us. We want transparency in real estate acquisitions. You get 70% of your budget from Congress, so you have to let us know what's going on, even though you have your own board of regents. You have a great story to tell to the American people and to visitors from around the world. We thank you for that, and we want to be part of helping you tell that story. So I'll look forward to our discussion today, and I'll now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Chairwoman Titus. I want to welcome Secretary Bunch, the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, and congratulate him on his appointment. I was talking with him earlier that the last time I saw him was when he gave remarks on the 50th anniversary of the death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You were both eloquent and inspiring. Secretary Bunch brings a significant amount of experience and knowledge to the position. As director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, he oversaw the development and opening of this project. Secretary Bunch, bringing your experience and background to bear on museums, research, and programs across the Smithsonian will be critical. With that said, the committee's jurisdiction focuses on the Smithsonian's buildings and grounds. Smithsonian has 19 museums, 9 research centers, 3 cultural centers, and the National Zoo, and owns or leases nearly 14 million square feet of space and nearly 29,000 acres of land. While the Smithsonian raises funds on its trust side, a majority of the Smithsonian's budget is funded by the taxpayer through appropriations. Smithsonian's buildings, acquisition, and space management practices have a significant impact on cost, accessibility to the public, and the artifacts that the Smithsonian is trusted with. With the proposed purchase of 500,000 square feet of space for a headquarters building and the $650 million renovation of the Air and Space Museum, we need to ensure these projects make sense and are appropriately managed. We owe the taxpayer full transparency regarding how their dollars are being spent and why. That is why our oversight is critical and why it is important for this committee to receive timely and accurate information. It's critical that where the Smithsonian requires authorization for projects and activities, such needs should be communicated to your authorizing committees. In 2016, for example, the Smithsonian promised this subcommittee during a hearing that we would be kept fully up to date on its plans for its leased administrative office space. Yet the committee received few details on the plans for a new headquarters building until years later. We still have questions on this acquisition and whether the proposed arrangement, a condo-style purchase, makes sense. We know your deferred maintenance is significant. We also recognize the challenge with balancing budget constraints with the need to invest in maintenance to avoid more costly repairs in the future. But if we can find ways to better utilize the trust side to address this issue, we can leverage private dollars to potentially help meet these needs. Secretary Bunch, I know these issues predate your appointment. That said, we look forward to working to improve transparency and communication and working together to find innovative ways to help you manage the space you need to carry out your mission. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I'll now go to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, good to see you again. And again, congratulations. The chair raised a number of issues. I won't be repetitive of concerns that I have. I mean, in particular, I'm hoping that you're going to address what we're going to do with the maintenance backlog. I mean, over $1 billion, and you've had to relocate the headquarters out of the castle, and want to know how how we're going to get all this done and how quickly we can get it done and begin to pay that down. And then obviously you're going to have to you'll be moving artifacts around during some of the restoration work, and you're acquiring new. So I'm also curious about long-term plans for storage. I appreciate the fact that you own the majority of your buildings, unlike many federal agencies who end up paying. The taxpayers don't benefit when we lease and release and release and release. And so by owning, you are helping conserve resources, and I appreciate that. But then along comes the obligation for the maintenance. So. And then I do want to emphasize, and hopefully we can sort of turn a new page here with the relationship between the authorizing committee and the institution. For whatever reason, we've seen a lot of end runs to the appropriations committee, and we want to approach your concerns and problems and future plans thoughtfully in authorizing language. And if things are happening over in approps that are basically impacting those things, we need to know, and we can be helpful with appropriations, but also we are the authorizing committee, and there's a little sensitivity around that. And as the chair mentioned, we have, at this point, plans and authorization for 2 new museums, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, since I believe the Smithsonian provides a 50% match on those institutions. And the federal government obviously will have obligation, and then question about location, any ideas you have on that, or it may be premature at this point. So with that, Madam Chair, I'd love to hear from the Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Secretary, welcome once again. For the record, we have Dr. Lonnie Bunch III, who is the Smithsonian Institution Secretary, and we're delighted to have you and look forward to hearing your testimony. Without objection, our witness's full statement will be included in the record, and since your written testimony will be part of the record, we request that you limit it to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Is that now working now? Okay, thank you. My tenure as the 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian is just beginning. However, my relationship with the Smithsonian goes back to 1978, when I first joined the institution as a historian at the National Air and Space Museum. Then I served as the Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs at the National Museum of American History. And then finally, I was fortunate enough to be the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I am pleased and humbled to assume the role of Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, an institution that I love so much. But for most of our visitors, their first impression of the Smithsonian is of our iconic buildings on the National Mall, home to some of the nation's greatest treasures. What they may not realize is that the Smithsonian extends far beyond the mall. Since our founding, the Smithsonian has been a local, national, and global institution doing work that you might not expect. The global team that captured the first image of a black hole was directed by Smithsonian scientists at our Astrophysical Observatory in Cambridge. Researchers at the National Zoo and the Conservation Biology Institute work to reintroduce species that have gone extinct in the wild back to their native habitat. Experts at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center track and monitor invasive species in every port in the United States. Though I've spent my entire career at the Smithsonian, I am constantly amazed because I'm learning new things about this wondrous institution. But all these incredible achievements are enabled by our facilities, which face tremendous challenges. Much of the Smithsonian's infrastructure is aging, with systems that have exceeded their lifespan. As a result, many of our facilities fall short of industrial best practices for their care and maintenance. This is the result of an accelerated growth in Smithsonian buildings that spans several decades. Currently, we have a maintenance backlog of just over $1 billion. A $1 billion backlog may sound insurmountable, but it's not. Since becoming secretary, I've had a chance to look at this with fresh eyes. In order to be more strategic in our approach, I've directed our staff to begin analyzing our projects in a new way. Rather than simply seeing a backlog in total as $1 billion, I want us to analyze our maintenance projects building by building. With this approach, we have a better sense to communicate our existing priorities, develop a better sense of where our limited federal dollars are best spent, and find opportunities to address our maintenance needs as part of our capital revitalization projects. The strategic combination of capital projects with steady growth and maintenance from Congress will yield greater results. I believe that addressing our maintenance backlog is of paramount importance to the future of the Smithsonian. We are so fortunate to receive support of Congress in addressing our recent and most pressing infrastructure needs, the renovation of the National Air and Space Museum. Because of this support, we are on track. Exhibits in the western half of the building are scheduled to reopen in 2022 and to fully reopen in 2025. Beyond air and space, we are beginning to plan for the revitalization of 2 of our oldest buildings, the Castle and the Arts Industries building. This project will address physical deterioration, replace obsolete systems, install seismic protection, and incorporate modern accessibility and safety standards. Planning for this project is an opportunity for us to develop a vision how best to use these historic landmarks to better serve our audiences. Projects like this are highly visible components of our immediate facility needs, but many of our greatest challenges are behind the scenes. We care for 155 million objects, most of which are not on display. They are actively used as research objects by dozens of federal agencies, scientists worldwide. But sadly, 47% of our collection space is inadequate. To address this problem, we've begun implementing a collection space plan, an ongoing cycle of constructing state-of-the-art facilities, relocating at-risk collections, and revitalizing substandard spaces. We are making steady progress. We recently finished a collection space building at the National Air and Space Museum, Udvar-Hazy Center. It was immediately used as swing space to help us move the artifacts from the air and space as it's going under renovation. And when the air and space is completed, that storage space will allow us to remove many of the aviation collections that are in poor conditions at Garber. We've got a planning phase for additional pods at the Smithsonian Museum Center, Support Center, and for this project, we are collaborating with the National Gallery of Art to share construction costs and operations of this facility. This is a win-win situation for both institutions. But as we look at potential future facility needs, there are many knowns but many unknowns. We know that our collections will grow. Research continues to advance and history unfolds before our eyes. And to continue to tell the story of America, we need to continue to collect collections. But we also know that we have to protect those collections in light of the changing environment. We know that Washington, D.C. will have more intense precipitation, increased storm surge, a rising Potomac, so we know that the National Mall may be at risk. We've already implemented preventative measures. We've moved many of the archives of the National Air and Space Museum out to Udvar-Hazy Center. We have relocated objects from the ground floors of the National American History Building, which is really the building most at risk. And when we look to build new buildings, we did what we did with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We made sure that water protection measures were incorporated into the design so that the Smithsonian, if they are mandated to collect to build new museums, we want to make sure that climate considerations will be crucial. The prospect of new museums is really the great unknown for us. The current proposals for a National Museum of American Latino and National Women's History Museum enjoy broad bipartisan support. As I've said to you and many others, if Congress deems it in the public interest to move forward with these proposals, we believe it's critical that any additions to the Smithsonian do not negatively impact our existing facilities, many of which I will outline for you today. A new museum needs funds both for the creation and the long-term operation, the care of collections, the building of staff, and the safety and protection of our visitors. It is my responsibility to ensure that all our museums, all our research centers are appropriately cared for. But I believe with proper support, we can create new museums that exceed our imaginations and build on the standards of excellence set by the Smithsonian. This desire for new museums reflects a need to ensure that our nation's cultural institutions provide a complete and inclusive representation of the American experience. We will work diligently to tell a broader, more complete narrative with the resources we already have. I'm proud of the work that we've done with the Latino Center and the Asian Pacific Center, and most recently, we've launched the American Women's History Initiative. All of these efforts work to make sure that the Smithsonian, beyond individual museums, creates programs, mounts exhibitions, and grows collections. The Smithsonian is the steward of the nation's museums, collections, exhibits, research, libraries, and educational resources. Our museums are powerful symbols of our shared cultural values. The buildings that line the National Mall tell the world what it means to be an American. Our cultural institutions are greater than the sum of their parts. They are more than bricks and mortar. Because of that, I thank you for taking the time to hold this hearing and making our facilities such a priority. It's a privilege to testify before you today, and I welcome any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. We'll now move on to the members' questions. Each member will be recognized for 5 minutes, and I'll start by recognizing Mr. DeFazio.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I have to meet with the head of maritime safety for the Coast Guard, so I appreciate your accommodating my schedule. So, Mr. Secretary, you have a little bit of a, Smithsonian obviously has kind of a split personality here when you get, 62% of the budget comes from the feds and 100% of the maintenance. And then, you've got to come up with the balance. But again, this points us back to, authorization appropriations. And, I've been an authorizer for 33 years, and we get a little sensitive about these things. And there have been a couple of instances that were of concern where, at one point, you purchased a building and then paid the trust back with federal lease payments, and then you sold it for a profit and put the profit in the trust, and then leased it back again. Again, all without sort of, I would say, proper oversight. And now you want to buy a new headquarters building, and you've asked the appropriators to allow the Smithsonian to use federal rent payments to pay the trust back for the purchase, but the building will be owned by the trust and not the federal government. And at least your predecessor said the Smithsonian does not need authorization for that. Do you agree with that?
I think that what's clear to me is that the Board of Regents feels that they have great statutory authority based on the charter to enter into work with the trust that's for the mission of the Smithsonian. I think the most important issue for me is to say candidly, the Smithsonian has made a lot of mistakes in terms of communication, in terms of really working effectively with the authorizers. And the one thing I can say to you is, if I look at my career over the last 14 years, it's been clear that I've worked very well with Congress and I've really embraced transparency. So my notion is that the Smithsonian will not make those mistakes again. And one of the things I've done is I've asked the Smithsonian staff to work together, to bring together a group that will actually pull together a periodic white paper for members of Congress so that any issues that I think are important that need to be raised, you'll see them in a timely fashion. I am committed to making sure we don't repeat the mistakes of yesterday.
Okay, well, I appreciate that, and it sounds like perhaps we can begin to turn the page here, and that would be good, because we want to be advocates for you and help with these issues. But as far as I know, the annual appropriations bills at this point, I mean, you're recognizing Congress has to have a role, not just the Board of Regents, are authorizing your leasing authority. And is that, do you understand that that's the way it has been working?
Absolutely.
Right.
That we have statutory, you make sure that the federal leasing authority is something that you grant to us.
Right. Well, 40 USC 301 doesn't, allow for it to be sort of outside of the process. So I appreciate some recognition of that on your part. So at this point, I'm going to yield my time back to the chair for her more incisive questions, and I've got to run off and try and be an expert on maritime safety. So thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll continue that too, but I'd like to go back to the backlog that you mentioned, the $1 billion backlog. You said it's not insurmountable and you have some plans to address it. Could you lay out for us kind of some of those plans, so how you're going to retire it, since we already provide, excuse me, about 70% of the overall budget? Can you go somewhere else for the money as you look at these programs in a more piecemeal fashion rather than just coming back for an additional appropriation?
I think we're going to look at this in several different ways. What's important to me is that this is one of the priorities for the institution. It's crucial to our future. It seems to me that One, I do want to acknowledge the fact that you have helped us by giving us more resources to wrestle with our deferred maintenance and our backlog. That's crucial, and we're working now to think about what's the best strategy to do that moving forward. And what we realized is, one is to have a better systematic approach to what is our backlog, and to be able to understand what are the priorities so that we can really make decisions about today and for tomorrow. We also realize that one of the key things we have to do is, in addition to spending money for maintenance, is to make sure we're spending money on preventative maintenance. That for us, this is really the key, and we've really begun to rethink how we do that, to make sure that we can maintain the newest of buildings as well as many of the older buildings. Part of what we want to try to do is recognize that when we do our capital revitalization projects, that what we want to do is use those as a way to get at some of this backlog. If you look, for example, at what we're doing with the Air and Space Museum, that allows us, in addition to the rejuvenation of that building, it allows us to address more than $200 million of deferred maintenance. So we're looking at different strategies to do this. We also always look to see if there are private donors that can support us. But the truth of the matter is, very few donors are interested in providing for that kind of back-of-the-house, non-visible. But it doesn't mean that we can't think creatively about when we're looking for support for major exhibitions, can a part of that be peeled off to help with that? We're looking at a variety of ways to do that. But I think the systematic approach, really marrying the capital rejuvenation with backlog and really doing much better job of preventive maintenance will allow us to really take a good whack at this. The reality is that we would love to be at 3% of the CRV, which would allow us not only to end backlogs, but to begin to cut them down in significant ways. So we're looking at all the different ways we can do it, but I do think this new systematic approach will at least give us clarity.
Thank you. I know at one point it was recommended that you do like 2.8%, and the reality was about 1%.
We're at 1%. We're looking at what are other possibilities.
I will go back to the chairman's questions about the statutory authorization for the purchase. Do you have an internal document that justifies that purchase, or have you just relied on this is the way it was done before, or have the appropriators said it's okay? Because at one point the House didn't agree with the Senate on what was going to be allowed for the Smithsonian to do in terms of this kind of condo arrangement.
Well, I think what we're relying on is the sort of charter and the history of the Smithsonian. But what I'd like to do, for the record, is go back and have the experts who know this better than I prepare a response for you in that area. Because I'm a pretty good historian, but not a good lawyer.
All right, thank you. We'll ask them to do that. Well, would you just address a little further the two new museums that are being proposed, and how do we find somebody like you to head up those efforts? Is that going to be possible?
You flatter me. I think that it's important to realize that the Smithsonian, given the right resources, can make institutions that are magical. And I think we can find people that can do that. The question really is, can we really get the resources that are needed, both federal and private, to build the institutions, but also to maintain them? And can we do it in such a way that the Smithsonian continues to receive the resources it needs to maintain its current programs and current buildings? That's the challenge. With that done, there is no doubt in my mind we can make major institutions that will make the world proud.
And in the meantime, though, you have initiatives going in both of those areas, I believe.
What's key for me is my whole career has been about expanding the canon, making sure that the diversity of America is explored in many ways. And I'm very proud of what the Smithsonian has done. I think the Latino Center, which has been around for 20 years, has really done something crucially important. It has embedded curators in different museums who care about Latino culture. And as you know, in a museum, curators are the people that shape everything, even more than directors. And to have that support, congressional support that allowed us to do that, really does begin to make a difference. So My hope is that even if there isn't a museum, we will continue to make sure those stories are told very powerfully. And I'm very proud of the new, relatively new initiative on American Women's History Initiative, because I think it's crucial for us to recognize that we at the Smithsonian should not be telling stories about women just because they're separate stories. We should be saying that the story of women is really the best lens to understand what it means to be an American. So therefore, all the institutions that touch that as part of the Smithsonian should be doing that. And so this new Women's History Initiative is allowing us to do that. So the best part about that is that if there are museums, we now have people that are working in those areas, collections are beginning to be built. Obviously, they would be a foundation upon which any new museum would build.
I know that's true in Las Vegas with the Atomic Testing Museum. There's a whole oral history project of women who were there, who are certainly in the minority, but who have an interesting story to tell. So,
and I think it's so interesting that, because I've listened to that oral history project, and what it really tells you is how central they were to the project itself, right? And so that in essence, it's not an ancillary story, it's the central story. And that's what I'd like the Smithsonian to do when it comes to women's history.
thank you. I may come back in a minute, but we'll move ahead. Who's this lady? Ms. Miller, will be recognized.
Thank you, Chairwoman Titus, for having this today, and welcome
Thank you.
to our committee. I believe that art and science and culture are so very important, a part of human history. In my little state of West Virginia, people just associate beautiful trees and coal mines, but we have culture. We have Lebanese people, Italian people. There are still pockets of individuals that speak almost Elizabethan English. This culture is so important. I must say that I'm a little biased because I was a member of the West Virginia Commission for the Arts for a number of years. So what you do, I hold very dear to my heart as well. And I think it's very important for our future generations that they are able to share in our culture, our diverse culture, and the art, and just how we can educate people. And you know, now that we understand that STEAM education is so important and that the arts do hold a wonderful part to our lives. In your testimony, you mentioned disaster-resistant building design. Do you plan to include disaster-resistant building updates in your revitalization plans?
Because the issue of sustainability is so important to me, as evidenced by the work we did at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, we have taken on a desire to make sure that everything we do is pointing us towards sustainability. We will look, as we're beginning to look at what we're redoing with the castle and the Arts and Industries building, we will look and see what are the things we can do to make it sustainable, to make sure that it's protected against disaster. It is early, so we don't have any plans, formal plans, but the goal, the commitment is to make sure that these buildings contribute a sense that the Smithsonian is modeling the kind of sustainability we expect.
Can you tell us about how you're analyzing maintenance on a building-by-building basis?
What we're looking at is, instead of saying, you know, we have $1 billion backlog and it's all lumped together, what I want to do is to be able to go through every system in every building so we know when they're at the end of their lives, where we are now, what are the ones that are most crucial. And that would then allow us to every year begin to make adjustments to make sure that we're spending our money at the most important parts of the institution's facilities that need to be preserved and revitalized. I think that by doing that, it'll also give us a discipline to be able to make sure that we're spending the time on preventive maintenance as well as fixing old lasting problems.
Are you making progress in terms of prioritizing that funding?
I think we are. What we've done is I've asked the staff to really make this the priority, and so we're working on pulling that data together. I don't have it yet, but it's something I've asked the staff and I will have.
You know, even in your own home, you put the date on the hot water tank when you replace it. You put the date on the furnace so you know when you've done work on your roof. I'm sure it's the same, just millions of dollars larger. What are some of the maintenance challenges that you foresee in the next couple of years?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is that for so long, the Smithsonian has created new facilities with not corresponding maintenance support. And so really it is now to basically turn that around and put the resources and put the time and energy to make sure that we don't continue for this hole to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So my goal is to basically, one, bring a systematic approach to it, and then look as creatively as we can to address this. We will always need congressional support to help do that.
Absolutely. And can you tell us about the specific changes that you plan to make in revitalization of the castle and the arts and industries buildings?
I think it's early in the work to be able to be very specific, except I can say that the Arts and Industries Building and the Castle are two of the buildings that mean a lot to me. The Arts and Industries Building, as you know, has spent a lot of money to take care of the exterior, that we've given stability, the roof is strong, but it's still a shell. And at this stage, what we're doing is we're testing the use of it. We did the installation, my installation in there. We've done things with the Folklife Festival. We want to see how that space can be fixed and how it can be used. The challenge is that we still have to fix all the internal systems. There are issues of accessibility, safety that have to be addressed. But what we're doing is we're putting together a team of people that are looking at the 275th anniversary of the Smithsonian. And what we want is we want the exhibition to be in that building, and we want to use that to begin to actually move pieces in that'll make that building more useful again and usable and test what we can do. The truth of the matter is the Arts and Industries Building is still a major work in progress because there's so much that needs to be done. In terms of the castle, I think we are really at the preliminary stages. What I've asked is that I want to look at the castle as more than an office space. How is it something that we serve the visitors better? The space is more accommodating to visitors. So we're really beginning now to look at that plan to say, how is this both a space of office and people, but how is it also something that provides auditoria, provides space to engage the public more effectively? So right now, we're in the beginning stage of those plans, and I'm just getting briefed on that now.
Thank you, Mr. Bunch. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Ms. Holmes Norton to ask questions for 5 minutes, and remember, this is your constituent.
I won't let anybody forget it. And I want to congratulate you once again, Mr. Bunch, on what you have done and on the vote of confidence you really have had in your past work, which is why you're where you are now. I'm intrigued by the real estate deals that the trust has done, and I almost want to congratulate you on them. The Congress doesn't look like it's going to fork over any money soon. Some of them raise a little eyebrows, but as long as they don't violate the Anti-Deficiency Act, it seems to me that we ought to let you be as experimental as you can be. This headquarters move from the castle to a building where it looks like you're already in part of that building on Maryland Avenue. Is that a building you would like to buy in its entirety?
What we did, as you recall, is that after talking to GSA to get some guidance, we did an RFP where there were 5 basically sites that were in the running. 2 were very conducive. One was an empty site that had construction, and the other was Cap Gallery. And part of where we are leaning towards now, and part of the issue for us was, where can we consolidate the most of our staff? Where can we be sure we're not going to run into building construction delays and the like? And also, in some ways, because there's been so much investment, if you will, in the Cap Gallery space in terms of our emergency control centers and archives there, that it made better sense once we analyzed everything to acquire portions of that building. And the challenge is, as you framed it, what we are attempting to do, would like to acquire one complete tower and part of the second. That in essence, we enter into a partnership. that we have a partner who is going to handle some of the retail, some of the parking, some of the spaces we don't need. And that ultimately it would allow us to provide the adequate security and completely in one tower, and then look appropriate measures for security in the second tower. I think in a way, there's no doubt this can be seen as a little unorthodox, but the real challenge is we need to think as the Smithsonian how to be more nimble in the 21st century. And I think working to consolidate the leases, thinking about new ways of ownership will allow us, I think, to ultimately save the federal government money and serve the taxpayer better.
And you think, again, along with your deals, that you have the funds to purchase this building?
What we have, what we're asking is the opportunity to, we'll get a bond that will pay for. What we'd like to be able to do is use the federal rent money that we're receiving to put that into the trust account and use that to pay down the debt.
And you think you can work the deal that way?
We hope you will let us work the deal that way, yes.
Well, considering that we're not appropriating money, it seems to me we've got to listen very carefully at how you intend to do it, because your creativity is welcomed. I am concerned, though, that the Smithsonian, in fact, the GAO did a study and found that those with independent authority are not in compliance with this reduced footprint that the rest of the federal government is in. I'm actually for the reduced footprint. And it seems to be working out very well. Remember, we're not talking about space for exhibitions. We're talking about spaces which sometimes federal employees work at home. In considering new space, have you considered this GAO report, which criticizes not only you, but all of those that have independent leasing authority? Have you considered bringing yourself, as you look for more space, into compliance with this reduced footprint that other agencies are held to?
What we're looking to do is, yes, is look at that, is that as part of, let's say, the Capitol Gallery, some of the space is already reconfigured, but any new space that we would use, we'd come in compliance. That's really important to us. The other thing that's crucial is that as we're trying to anticipate the future, we're trying to make sure we have enough space for swing space when we move people out of the castle, but even more importantly, if we're asked to build new museums, when we were asked to build the African American Museum, it took us a while to find the space, so I couldn't hire staff. So what I'm trying to do is give the Smithsonian as much flexibility as possible, so that if we are asked to take on more, we can handle that.
I see my time's expired. Thank you very much.
Just to your earlier question, I would point out again that the FY20 House Appropriations Bill specifically denied the Smithsonian's request to use the money from the rent to pay back the trust for the purchase of this. I know that we don't know what's going to happen with that bill, or if we're going to do continuing resolution, or there'll be a conference, but that will be a challenge. Is that correct?
I would have to double check that. I'm not 100% sure, but that sounds correct. They're nodding and telling me it's correct.
Okay, all right, thank you. Now,
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon. First, I want to discuss the proposed National Museum of the American Latino that HR 2420 has already 244 co-sponsors as we speak. And having the experience of the National Museum of African American, I would like to know what kind of impact a museum like this and the Women's Museum can help us out.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of what you said. I apologize.
I support the National Museum for American Latino. And I know when, at the time, the African American history and culture was in the research process, a lot of questions were asked. My question to you will be, what is needed to get that American Latino Museum finalized?
I think there are several things, because if there's one thing I know how to do, it's how to build a new museum. And I think that Part of it is recognizing that it's a longer-term commitment, that getting the resources to build the institution is one thing, but getting the resources to make sure you can hire the right staff, that you can build the collections that are needed, and that you've got the resources for the long run is really some of the challenges. I also think that in a very practical way, that when the African American Museum was asked to be built, it was a 50-50 public-private partnership, which I know that's the plan for the Latino Museum, but there wasn't a mechanism to ensure when those resources would be released. And that made it more difficult for planning and took extra years to get the process done. So there are some very specific things that I can say that would help move that process along. But I think the most important thing is to recognize that it's going to have to not only have the resources to open, but also resources to support the Smithsonian, because one of the most important things that happens when a new building comes on is that the maintenance, the security, there's central institution activities that are carried on independently of the museum, and we're going to need to give the Smithsonian the resource to be able to do that as well.
How can the Smithsonian Institute either provide already leased space for a new museum or acquire the necessary new space for a prospective museum?
I think that according to the legislation, the Smithsonian would be asked by the Board of Regents, would be asked to find the space, and we would look and see what are the available spaces. It would be based on everything from visitor access, there are environmental issues that we would look at.
It is realistic to still use the 150 feet per person that the GSA is requiring?
It's hard to use that for a museum itself. It's easier for office space, but it's harder to use that for a museum.
In the last Congress, this committee worked with the administration to pass H.R. 4009, the Smithsonian National Zoological Park Center Parking Facility Authorization, and will leverage using private financing to allow construction of the new parking at the National Zoo. But later on, the Smithsonian decided it will not proceed to this project. How is the Smithsonian planning to address the parking needs of the National Zoo?
I think that notion when we were going to build the parking at the zoo, ultimately the partner that we worked with wasn't effective, and we felt it wasn't the right part for us to do that. I think that at this stage, the Smithsonian is still always working with the District of Columbia to look at how we handle parking. One of the challenges of a new building is just the simple fact that it'll bring more people, and we do what we do, which is encourage people to take public transportation.
How can you decide whether you lease or buy new land? What's the measure for that?
The goal is always to get out of all these leases. These leases are things that ultimately will keep going up as new businesses, Amazon's coming to Virginia. So the goal is to try to limit as many leases as we can. And that's why owning a building, allowing us to consolidate leasing and staff is really ultimately a better business model and more effective down the road.
My question is made because one thing is having a new building or a new facility that is acquired by Smithsonian when it's a temporary facility, and another when it's a permanent one. How do you manage do you consult with GSA, with the General Accounting Office, or any other entity about the interest when you buy a property, whether it's better for the taxpayers' money when you need to put that money on front that actually having a lease? That's something that you work with the federal agencies, or it's just a decision from the Smithsonian Institute?
We have, for example, over this last, thinking about buying this new building, we did consult with GSA, got their guidance. We clearly are comfortable as we move forward looking at spaces that GSA may have. We'd be willing to have those conversations with GSA. You did that? You did have those conversations? We had some conversations where we asked for guidance from GSA as we went forward with the RFP. My time expired. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Secretary. Maryland's 4th Congressional District that I have the privilege to represent is home to the Museum Support Center, the Smithsonian's principal offsite collections, preservation, and research facility. It's located, as you know, in Maryland, Suitland, Maryland. The facility houses 55% of the institution's irreplaceable national collections, with approximately 300 full-time and about 50 rotating personnel. The center maintains the latest in museum technology and design to provide optimum conditions for the preservation and study of the Smithsonian's collections. I want to ask you a few questions about that, but before I do, I just want to take this opportunity to say I love the number 14. I love it for 2 reasons. One is I love our 14th Librarian of Congress, and I deeply admire our 14th Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. I want to congratulate you. No doubt your successful career will become a very storied career as an educator, historian, curator, director, president, founder, and now secretary. And having served in museums from Chicago to California and our nation's capital, I really, really appreciate your contributions to recording and preserving our nation's history, our heritage, our culture, and who we are and what we are as a people. So from the bottom of my heart, I really want to thank you.
Thank you.
Now my question. The Smithsonian has a 30-year collection space framework plan that would renovate almost 700,000 square feet of existing storage facilities and add an additional 1 million square feet of storage for a total cost of $1.3 billion. Can you tell us what the status of the plan's funding is, and how will the plan affect the Smithsonian's current $1 billion maintenance backlog?
As a former museum director, as a curator, the thing that I know is most important are the collections. And I think in 2015, when we came up with that collections framework, was one of the most important things the Smithsonian did in that area. Because for the first time, the Smithsonian understood exactly the status of all of its collections, all of its buildings, all of its housing. And as a result of that, it's allowed us to make very strategic decisions, in part with support from Congress, to be able to address that. And I'm pleased to say that the Smithsonian has made some major steps. I think, as you know, that we have entered into an agreement with the National Gallery of Art to construct a new pod out in the Suitland campus. And I think that's going to be really important as a way for us to begin to collaborate more effectively, but to also share the cost of doing these things. I'm also so pleased that what we've looked at are looking at some of the problems with the old Garber sites, were aviation sites. We've been able to decontaminate them. We've also completed a new pod out in Dulles, which allows us to take some of the material once the swing space is done, once we reopen the air and space, some of the material that were in weakened places, in facilities that were substandard, to move them into the new facilities. I think we've also, because of this plan, been able to look at Suitland and look at where we've been able to bring in new equipment that is more efficient, more space-saving. And I think maybe the most important thing for me is that we're in the process of finishing now a master plan just for the Suitland campus to really help us think more creatively, help us figure out what are the resources we need, because the Suitland campus is crucial. It's not going to solve all the problems, but being able to use that campus to its fullest extent will help the Smithsonian continue to be the institution that preserves America's culture.
Thank you. And just to follow up on that, because you now just referenced that the Suitland Collection Center master plan, which you just mentioned, and that's going to be completed, I believe, next year. Can you give us any preview on any additional storage facility projects that might be underway or that are planned for the near future in Suitland?
I'd love to tell you that, but we're still working on that final plan.
Excellent. Okay, my time's about to expire, so I won't burden you with another question. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. I apologize, Mr. Secretary, that more of us are not here. Some of our members are in impeachment hearings right now. Not that that's more important, but that's where they are. I would ask, does anybody have any additional questions?
I do have an additional question then, Madam Chair, thank you. So according to the fiscal year 20 budget request to Congress, the Smithsonian is only requesting $6.5 million for the facilities capital program at the Suitland Collection Center, $5.5 million for revitalization, $1 million for planning and design. I think that's on page 10. The total request for the facilities capital program in fiscal year 20 was $210 million. So do you believe that $6.5 million is sufficient funding for a project that should be prioritized?
I think that the notion was that we've got to make sure that we spend the money that is needed in Suitland. We've also got to take care of Dulles to be able to have this kind of ripple effect. So some of those choices are really about how do we make sure that we, in a logical way, are able to address this issue. I think that I will go back and relook at that and make sure I understand that more fully, but that's my understanding.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Ms. Gonzalez Colon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just get one extra question is, I do know how important it is for the American people to access the collections of the Smithsonian, but I also know that many people cannot afford to pay a ticket to Washington, D.C. and actually get the opportunity to visit those museums. And coming from Puerto Rico, I mean, we do have a lot of those people. What is the Smithsonian doing to allow access for those collections for people living in rural areas or areas that are not in Washington, D.C.?
One of my priorities as secretary is to realize that the Smithsonian should touch every school and every home. And one of the ways to do that is by really embracing the virtual Smithsonian, to really think about how do you create something that is not the virtual Museum of American History or the virtual art museum, but is the Smithsonian that allows the public to both have access to those amazing collections, but also the expertise of the scholars at the Smithsonian, and how to make sure that those collections also begin to shape the educational opportunities of students. So I think that one way is to really think with the new technologies, how does the Smithsonian virtually touch everyone? But then it's also building on things we do even better. I think that the Smithsonian Traveling Exhibition Services, which goes around the country, really does serve so many communities, large urban communities and also small rural communities. Projects like the Museum on Main Street, which brings stories to rural communities in sites that might not traditionally be seen as museum sites, is really an important contribution. I think the final piece is for the Smithsonian to work more effectively with its affiliates program. There are hundreds of institutions around the country that are affiliated with the Smithsonian. Let us do a better job of utilizing them as places to bring content, to bring collections, and that would allow the Smithsonian to extend its reach. So I'm committed to the kind of virtual Smithsonian and recognizing that our goal ought to be to touch every home, to touch every school.
Thank you for your service.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today, Mr. Secretary. I would just ask you in closing two things. One, you can tell from a number of members of the committee that there's concern about this new purchase because it is outside the box, and we want to be sure that it's properly authorized. It's not going to run into trouble down the road. So will you loan us your gentleman in the blue shirt to meet with our staff to answer some of those questions, and then we won't have to go into them today with you?
Absolutely.
Or whoever is appropriate, but he seems to nod or shake whenever something is asked. And my second request is that you will just look to us and have us be a partner with you and not just focus everything on appropriations, but remember that we are here and this committee wants to be engaged and we want it to be a positive, collaborative relationship.
I agree. My history has been a good collaborative relationship throughout Congress, and I will continue to do that.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, let me get back to the script here. I want to do this officially. All right, I'll now ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted in writing. And unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. So if no other members have anything to add, this committee stands adjourned. Thank you.